In this course, American Economic History, we are going to take a look at why the U.S. economy grew and developed the way it did. This also hopefully will give us some insights into the current structure of the American economy and some of the current economic problems that you study in your other courses. We can't understand how the American economy began, how it began to develop during the colonial period without taking a look at the European background. By the 1500s, the European countries that faced the Atlantic Ocean, England, France, Portugal, Spain, and also the Netherlands, all realized that the key to continued development, the key to national wealth, was to develop long-distance and international trade. I heard stop right there. Oh, I'm sorry. Should I just ignore everything I hear from...
Yeah.
Oh. Okay. You want me to start over? I can just pick it up and just edit that out. If you speak up, I can. Okay. This course, American Economic History, is going to take a look at the way the United States economy grew and developed. This will give us hopefully some insight into why the American economy is structured the way it is, and also hopefully some background into some of the reasons for some of the current economic problems of the American economy. It's impossible to talk about how the American economy began in the colonial period without knowing just a little bit about the European background that led to the migration to the New World. By the 1500s, the new nation states of Europe, particularly the ones that faced the Atlantic Ocean, England, France, Spain, Portugal, but also including the Netherlands, all realized that the key to national wealth and the key to national power was in developing long-distance and international trade. So as a part of their nation-state rivalry, their political rivalries in Europe, these countries entered into competition to control long-distance and international trade, sending out colonies around the world, including to the newly discovered New World, the Americas, was an extension of that nation-state rivalry. Now, the two countries we're particularly interested here is the rivalry between Spain and England. In the 1500s, Spain was the most powerful country in Europe. Everyone knew that one of the reasons why Spain was so powerful, why Spain could field such large armies and pay for them, was because of the large amount of gold and silver that Spain was taking out of the New World, particularly the silver mines in Mexico and in Peru. So other countries also went looking for gold and silver or any connection around the world that would increase national wealth. England eventually became one of the major rivals of Spain in Europe. This rivalry was almost inevitable. Beside the nation-state rivalry, Spain was the foremost Catholic country in Europe, and England by the end of the 1500s was becoming one of the foremost Protestant countries of Europe. So the nation-state rivalry had an overlay of religious conflict. In 1588, Spain finally decided that they had enough with English, what we would now call pirates. At the time they were called privateers, people like Sir Francis Drake, who, with the connivance of the English crown, went out and captured Spanish ships filled with gold and silver and brought them back to England. And Spain decided to invade England, put this piracy in the high seas to rest once and for all. They sent a large fleet called the Spanish Armada to invade England. This fleet was defeated, and England did not feel threatened, at least from invasion from Spain after that. Well, this gave the English a tremendous amount of self-confidence, and for the first time they really seriously began thinking about planting colonies in the New World to rival the Spanish colonies. The problem was that England was basically a poor country. The English government did not have the kinds of resources to fund, to pay for, sending English colonists to the New World. So what the English did was the English crown chartered private companies, gave them the power and the right to send groups of colonists to the New World. These companies were private companies. They sold stock. In fact, they were some of the earliest joint stock companies in Europe, and they were set up not only to further English interests in the New World, but also, of course, to make a profit. The groups that were set up, particularly made up of merchants in London, were in some ways not particularly typical of English society, and in fact it is an indication of how poor the English government was and how desperate they were to have colonies in the New World, that they gave charters to groups that were not in political favor. Some of the groups were dominated by Puritans, and then later in the 1600s one of the largest land grants was given to the Penn family, a prominent Quaker family. Now, to understand why that was somewhat unusual is you have to also understand the religious conflict that was going on in England in the late 1500s, and particularly in the first half of the 1600s. Henry VIII had nationalized the Catholic Church in the 1530s, had seized all the church property, which included approximately about 1/3 of the land in England, expropriated much of the movable wealth for himself, sold much of the land or gave it away to his favorites, so that the Catholic Church had been expropriated. England was Protestant, became the church religion. Henry set up the Church of England, the Anglican Church. The American equivalent are the Episcopalians, and everyone in England had to join the Church of England. By the early 1600s, however, there was tremendous conflict within the Church of England. Many people in England had become influenced by the writings of John Calvin, and what they believed was that the Church of England was not Protestant enough. It was still too reminiscent of the Catholic Church. They wanted reforms within the Church of England. They wanted to purify the church. They were unhappy with the liturgy. They wanted more sermons. They were unhappy with the vestments that were worn by the ministers. They were unhappy with the aisle. They were unhappy with rose windows with pictures of saints. All these things reminded them of Catholic churches, and they wanted to do away with all of that. So there was a tremendous internal conflict going on at the time. By the 1620s, however, it was obvious that the Puritans were losing the battle for control of the Church of England. The new king, Charles I, had installed some vigorous bishops who were basically purging the church of Puritans. So one of the motivations for Puritans coming to the New World was they had pretty well given up on their plans to purify, reform the Church of England. So there was a mixture of motivations of why people came to the New World. Part of it had to do with English nationalism. Part of it, as we will see when we talk about Virginia, had to do with personal advancement. Part of it had to do with not being able or not feeling comfortable living in the English society of the 1620s and wanting to remove themselves from the influence of king and bishop. So groups of colonists were put together, recruited to a large extent by the charter companies that had the right to send people out to the New World in the hope, again, of making a profit. These companies did recruit different groups, and shiploads of colonists were sent off into the New World. Colonies were organized. They were planted. That's why sometimes they are called plantations. The first three major colonies were in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, and then in Massachusetts Bay, Boston in 1630, although there were some small amount of settlers came to Massachusetts Bay before then. The first colony was in Jamestown, Virginia. It was sent over by the Virginia Company, and it was sent over as a straight profit-making venture. At first, they hoped they would find gold and silver that they could send back to England. They immediately realized that there wasn't any gold and silver around. The natives didn't have were not wearing a large amount of gold and silver jewelry as they were in, say, the Aztec tribes in Mexico City or the Incas in Peru. So that they had to look for other things, raw materials that they could send back to England to be processed, or which would include something like spices, for example. But basically, when they got over there, they didn't find anything. What they found was a wilderness. They were somewhat surprised, in fact, by what they found. The environment was a great deal more hostile than some of the reports that they had read back in England. The coming of the Pilgrims to Plymouth was a little bit different. They basically were looking for a place where they could practice their religion apart from European influence. A relatively small group. They were a group of separatists, people who had separated themselves from the Church of England. The best organized group that came over in the early years were the Puritans, who came over to Massachusetts Bay. All three groups, however, had to deal with the harsh reality of the New World, and they really weren't prepared for this. In the first year at Jamestown, approximately 2/3 of the first group of settlers died. The first year in Plymouth, approximately 1/2 of the settlers died. Somewhat lower death rate among the Puritans who came to Massachusetts Bay because they were better organized and had heard the stories of how difficult it was in the New World. These death rates continued for years in places like Virginia. Typically, give an example, probably the worst is in 1609, a new set of settlers were sent out to Jamestown, approximately 800 people. By the following spring of 1610, out of the 800 people, there were only 60 survivors. The 60 survivors, in fact, had decided to abandon Jamestown and were, in fact, leaving when relief ships and new settlers showed up with food and provisions, and they went back and continued the settlement. By the way, the head of the saving convoy was Lord Delaware, who was remembered in the area because of this, and of course got a state named after him. So they're facing these hardships in the New World that were really unexpected. To give you kind of a feel for what it was like, rather than just reading about it, as you probably have, is two quick excerpts from letters that were sent back to England, one of them, and the other one was a letter written in the 1600s, just a small part out of both letters. The first one was from a Reverend Samuel Smith writing to his son Ichabod Smith in 1699, describing his childhood along the Connecticut River, probably in the 1640s. This is just a small part of the types of things they had to deal with. And he tells his son, "The great terror of our lives was the wolves, catamounts," that's Puritan shorthand for cats of the mountains, wild cats, "were bad enough, and so was the bears, but it was the wolves that was the worst. The noise of their howlings was enough to curdle the blood of the stoutest, and I have never seen the man that did not shiver at the sound of a pack of them. My mother and sister did each of them kill more than one of the gray howlers." Things were worse in Virginia. In 1623, 16 years after the first landing, things were just as bad as they were described in the first couple of years. This is a letter from a young man back to his parents in England. "This is to let you understand that I, your child, am in a most heavy case by reason of the nature of the country, which is such that it causeth much sickness, such as the scurvy and the bloody flux and divers other diseases, which maketh the body very poor and weak. And when we are sick, there is nothing to comfort us. For since I came out of the ship, I never ate anything but peas and water gruel, and I have nothing to comfort me, nor there is nothing to be gotten here but sickness and death." By that time, over half the people he was on his ship had died, and all the men who were left were sick. There wasn't one healthy man among them. So this is the terrible conditions that they had to face. Now, the consequence of this, the consequence of facing this new environment, from coming out of the relatively settled and civilized European environment to this howling wilderness — they almost always have the adjective howling in front of the word wilderness — was greatly unsettling to the settlers. Created these high death rates, which tended to dissolve the social structure, particularly in places like Jamestown. But it did something else, particularly in a place like Jamestown. The Jamestown settlement was conceived of basically as a fort, as a place where predominantly male population would set up a fort, would also then go around and again try to trade with the Native Americans, or find a mineral, something they could send back to England that would be profitable to both the settlement and their English backers. But what they found instead was this harsh environment, this wilderness with unending forests, with howling animals at night that they had never encountered before in their life. They had very little idea of how to raise food, for example. Both the people in Virginia and the Pilgrims really weren't prepared to even do something as basic as raise food, raise grain crops. On the other hand, however, is particularly in Virginia, the motivation of the people who came out was to get away from English society, because they were told and believed there was more opportunity, more personal opportunity in a place like Jamestown, whereas in a more structured society like in England, they knew that there wasn't any real chance for them to get ahead. So it was a combination of these two things that began to undermine the kinds of societies that were planned for Jamestown, that were planned for Plymouth, that were planned, in fact, for Massachusetts Bay by the people who backed the colonists and then the leaders who came over with them. New environment and also new opportunity. Unlimited amounts of land. Something, again, that was missing in England. In addition, in Jamestown, along with the starving that was going on, is they did rather early on find a cash crop. They actually found something that they could grow, send back to England, and in the early years make a great deal of profit. And that product was tobacco. So the combination in Jamestown of this harsh environment and then this personal opportunity, in fact, to make a great deal of money quickly, dissolved this kind of structured military society that was planned by the promoters of Jamestown. So what we saw early on in Jamestown was something that is going to happen again and again in American history, is that people would plan to have a certain kind of society, but faced with both the harsh reality of the environment and the personal opportunity, these types of societies began to dissolve. The first instinct of all immigrants to the United States, to the Americans, to the Americas, was to bring over their values, to bring over their mores, their customs, and to reproduce the kinds of societies that they knew, the kinds of societies they felt comfortable with. But because of, again, the environment, because of the opportunity to get rich quick in tobacco, what happened in Jamestown was very similar to what happened again and again in American society, is that traditional social structures broke down very quickly. Authority broke down. You had a society of a lot of young, unattached men, again, very, very competitive, tending to be somewhat violent. What you had basically was kind of the traditional kind of frontier town. Little authority, weak social control, weak social institutions, no established church, none of the established positions of authority, representatives of the king, for example. And so these towns were like boom towns, were like what were later mining towns, say, later in American history. So what happened was this attempt to reconstruct traditional European societies in the wilderness, right from the beginning, in places like Jamestown, and then later I'm going to talk about what happened in Puritan New England, places like Jamestown began to dissolve. And what came out of that? Facing the wilderness, facing the opportunity, what came out of that was the kind of society, the kind of set of values, and the kind of behavior that we now identify as distinctly American. And that kind of social change from European to American, the kind of social behavior that we are all familiar with today in the United States, began early on in American history, from the first years of colonial history. So we can see again how the environment affected behavior. Cut. Okay. Can we wait till the thing gets finished? I want to wait till that's finished clicking. Okay? In the 1600s, when you talk about the economy of British North America, you're really talking about two areas that accounted for most of the economic activity. The first area was around the Chesapeake Bay, Virginia, and Maryland. And the second area centered around Massachusetts Bay, Boston, Massachusetts, Connecticut, all the way to the Connecticut River. What I'd like to do is to talk about the economy of the Puritans, the economy of Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans who came over to Massachusetts Bay were, to in many ways, much different than most of the immigrants to British North America in the 1600s and the 1700s. First of all, they were better organized. They came over with farm implements, with farm animals, with supplies, unlike many of the immigrants who just came over almost literally with the clothes on their back. The second thing that made the Puritans different is they came over in families rather than as individuals. Most of the immigrants to Jamestown were relatively young, single males. Most of the women who came over were also young and single. The men who came over with the Puritans tended to be older. They tended to be heads of households. They brought their families with them. They brought their servants with them. They also came over as groups. It was not uncommon that a large part of an entire congregation would come over, complete with their ministers. So they brought their society along with them too. The goal in Massachusetts Bay was to establish a practical utopia. It was to establish the kind of society the Puritans would have liked to establish back in England, but because of the opposition of King and Anglican bishops, they were not able to establish. And it became obvious again in the 1620s that they in fact were losing ground in their battle for the control of the Church of England and English society. So, in despair, many Puritan leaders decided that the second best thing to do would be to establish the kind of society they wanted, far away from the influence of bishops and king. And the place that seemed most likely for them to do that was going out into the wilderness. Again, the biblical reference here, going out into the wilderness to establish a different kind, a more moral society. And they're very conscious of this. John Winthrop, who was going to be their political leader for an entire generation, gave the one group of Puritans a little pep talk on board a ship before they landed, and he told them that what they were really doing was establishing a city upon a hill, a famous phrase in American history. And the Puritans understood that he didn't mean literally a city sitting on top of a hill, that he was referring, what he really meant was they were establishing New Jerusalem. And you can see that kind of mentality even today in the names of many of the towns and cities in New England that were established by Puritans. Salem, New Canaan, New Haven, Goshen, Bethel in Massachusetts, Hebrew for City of God, for Temple of God. So that was the primary motivation, was to establish a Bible commonwealth, to establish a Calvinist society based upon Calvinist beliefs. So when they landed, they quickly began to organize themselves to do just that. They immediately organized themselves into small, tightly knit villages where everyone lived together. They organized churches. They built churches right away. They very rapidly established the Cambridge Theological Seminary to train ministers and Sunday school teachers in the New World. The Cambridge Theological Seminary later became Harvard University. They set up printing presses, and the first thing they printed was a book of Psalms, so that this was what was primarily on their mind, to establish this type of society based upon their religious beliefs. This society was based upon Calvinist beliefs, and at the heart of it was the idea of visible saints. The idea here was based upon a central idea, Calvinism, that society was divided into two groups, individuals who enjoyed the grace of God, who were saved, and sometimes Puritans would call them saints, and then the other group, of course, people who were going to be eternally damned, sinners. And the Puritans, of course, thought themselves as among the saved. So it was going to be a society of God's elect, of those who enjoyed God's grace, a society of visible saints. And that's the way the society was set up. Puritan churches would only accept people that could convince the minister and the elders that they in fact enjoyed God's grace. Magistrates, elected and appointed representatives, had to be members of congregations, and of course then that meant that they also were part of the saved remnant. Magistrates and ministers were kept separate. Ministers could not hold civil positions, but magistrates and ministers worked closely together to enforce the behavior and the moral code of the community. Only members of churches could vote, so that although there were people from even early on in Massachusetts Bay who were not Puritans, were not members of the congregational churches of the Puritans, they paid taxes, but they could not vote. Puritans controlled the society. They controlled the political mechanism. And this was the way the society was supposed to be. They also thought in terms that this would be a fairly static society, that this type of society would continue on. What happened, however, again, following on the idea of the last lecture, what happened to the Puritans, although it took a while, what happened to the Puritans was that the economic realities of the New World and the economic opportunities of the New World slowly dissolved this society. It slowly dissolved the moral and political basis of this society. In fact, it began to dissolve the political monopoly of the Puritans in New England, particularly Massachusetts. A number of factors entered into this. The first one was that over the period of the 1600s and 1700s is that New England, the people of New England, exhibited very rapid population growth. So it was kind of difficult to have a static society when there was this rapidly growing population. There were a great number of children forming new families. So that was the first problem, was facing this problem of what to do with this rapidly rising population. The estimate is that over the period of the 1600s and 1700s, population grew in New England and in fact in the Americas at about 3% a year, one of the highest sustained population growth rates ever recorded in history. And that may not sound like much. 3% a year really doesn't sound like a lot. What it means, though, is that population doubles every 24 years, every generation, and then it doubles again in another 24 years, and it doubles again in another 24 years. Over the course of 150 years, we are looking at a substantial increase in population. Well, but there's unlimited land, and virtually everybody in this society is a farmer, so it shouldn't make any difference if we have a great deal of land with population growth. It leads to some increase in population density in existing communities, but it should lead to new families being formed that set up new farms in the area. The problem in New England, as anyone who's ever traveled through there knows, is while there was substantial amounts of land relative to population, New England does not have good farmland. Much of New England either can't be farmed because it's too woody, it's too hilly, and even the farmland, when they began to clear the forest, the quality of the soil was rather poor. Also, a great deal of energy had to be expended on clearing the rocks and stones off the land. Even to this day, when you travel throughout parts of New England, you can see some of the stone walls where farmers and their mules took the stones out of the fields and stacked them up along the property line. So one of the ironies here is that while there is a virtually unlimited amount of land compared to population, or at least it appeared to the early settlers, is that the land isn't particularly good. It can't support a particularly large amount of people. The other problem was that the community could not just continue to move west. There was a limit, and that limit pretty much was the Connecticut River and the Connecticut River Valley. There was rapid movement into the Connecticut River Valley because that's where the good land was, but it was difficult to move west from there. The problem was political. On the other side of the Connecticut River was the Hudson River. That was controlled by the Dutch. The Dutch did not want English settlers in the Hudson River Valley, and the Dutch tended to have better relationships with the Indians and were able to use them to limit the expansion or create conflict when English settlers attempted to expand beyond the Connecticut River. So while farming continued to be the major economic activity, it did not lead to the kinds of higher than subsistence standards of living that immigrant Englishmen were used to. It was possible to raise food, although again in a world of growing population this became somewhat of a problem. But they were not able through farming to generate the kind of economic surplus that was necessary to increase standards of living, particularly per capita standards, again because population is going up. So there's a basic problem in this idea we're going to have a farm community-based society, is that there was this constant search for new farmland, constant search for better farmland. As families had a great number of children tended to move away. It tended to be a somewhat mobile society, which again was not what the Puritans had in mind. So that was the first problem. The second problem was that the Puritans began to arrive in 1630 in large numbers, and for the next 10 years, from 1630 to 1640, there was a large migration of Englishmen, mostly Puritans, to Massachusetts Bay, approximately 20,000, which at the time was a large number of people. For those 10 years, the basis of New England society was to provision, sell products, including startup farm implements, cows, seed, to provision the families that came over from England. Right from the beginning, and this was true throughout the entire colonial period in New England, is that New England had to import from England virtually everything that would make life a little more comfortable, make life more like what it was in England. The people of New England had to import, for example, their pots and their pans. They had to import their clothes. They had to import their farm implements if they were made out of, at least the metal parts of the farm implements. Any kind of luxury product, say porcelain, chinaware, things like that were imported from England. So that the standard of living in New England without the English imports was just too low. People were not willing to accept that. And what that meant is, while they had physically removed themselves from England, they were still Englishmen. They still had a certain expectation of a certain standard of living. But in order to get that, they had to keep commercial ties to England. That meant merchants in New England having ties with merchants back in London. Well, for the first 10 years, it worked out okay. Merchants in New England would import products or byproducts from Puritan farmers and then sell them to the immigrants who came into Massachusetts Bay, bringing money, which was, of course, highly highly enjoyable as far as the people in New England were concerned. That basis for society disappeared beginning in 1640. In 1640, civil war broke out in England between the Puritans and the supporters of the king, and immigration from England stopped. In fact, from then on, there was very, very little immigration into New England, both because English Puritans stayed home to fight the Civil War and run the government. Also, a number of New England Puritans went back to fight in the English Civil War in the 1640s. And then later on, the Puritans of New England discouraged people unlike themselves from coming into New England. They discouraged people from England if they weren't Puritans. They also discouraged migration from other parts of the American colonies. People from other religious groups, particularly Catholics, Baptists, Quakers, just weren't welcome in New England. So starting in 1640, the people in New England had to find a new basis if they were going to live beyond or a higher level than just subsistence. So they began looking for products they could sell. Now that ran into another problem, is that the New England economy was very similar to the English economy. They really didn't have anything that was so unique that they could ship back to England to pay for the imports into New England. They had no tropical products. They couldn't grow rice. They couldn't grow sugar. They couldn't grow tobacco, or at least very much tobacco. Later, tobacco was grown in the Connecticut Valley. They certainly had a great amount of fishery resources, but England itself had a very large fishing industry that left West England to go to the Grand Banks, go to Newfoundland. So they couldn't ship fish back to New England. The first product they found to ship back to New England to pay for the imports was beaver pelts. There was a fashion rage in Europe wearing things made out of beaver, particularly beaver hats, so that people in Massachusetts began to become fur traders. In fact, one of the first communities established on the Connecticut River, Springfield, Massachusetts, was established as an outpost for the fur trade by Thomas Pynchon. This looked like a product that, in fact, they could make a lot of money sending back to England. And starting in the late 1630s, 1640, they began a substantial trade in beaver furs, pelts, with Indian tribes in the area. The problem was, and again, this is something that is sounds very modern. The problem was that they killed off all the beavers. The demand was so great that, in their enthusiasm to, of course, make a lot of money quickly, is that they destroyed the beavers in the area, and by the 1650s the beaver trade was going downhill, and by the 1660s it had disappeared. So that basis for the economy disappeared. What they eventually came up with was a combination of things, mostly centering around fish first of all, and then shipping and shipping services. There was not a demand for New England fish in England. Again, English fisheries pretty well controlled that, but there was a demand for fish in southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, the islands off the coast of West Africa, and in the Mediterranean. And one of the reasons, and this is tremendously ironical, one of the reasons was the edict that Catholics could not eat meat on Friday, and there was a substitution of fish for meat, creating an increased demand for fish. Puritans, who intensely disliked Catholics, however, decided that this looked like it was a possible market for them, and began to ship salted fish from New England, Cape Cod, to southern Europe. This trade was organized by English merchants. The people, again, in New England did not have the resources to organize this trade themselves. Now, eventually what happened was that New England merchants began to control part of the trade. They controlled the part from shipping fish from New England to southern Europe. Usually they sold the fish to English firms in southern Europe who would give them credits that they could then use to buy imports from England back into New England. And this turned out to be a very important part of the development of New England society, selling fish to southern Europe. They took the payment either in credits from English exporters, or they brought back such products as wine and other products, sugar, other products of southern Europe and the islands off the coast of West Africa. So a trade begins, and New England merchants are not just importing products from England, but they are now exporting fish to southern Europe. The logical extension of that was the one thing New England did have was lots of trees. They had to cut down lots of trees. Trees were turned into timber, and some of the timber, in fact, was exported back to England to make ships in England, but a great amount of it that was used to start building ships in New England. So from using English ships to transport fish is that New England merchants began to, as they took their profits from the fishing trade, they began to use their profits to fund a new industry, shipbuilding. This turned out to be a major industry for New England in the colonial period. It is in fact estimated that by the time of the Revolution, that shipbuilding may have been the third or fourth largest industry in terms of selling products and services to other countries. Many of the ships were sold to English merchants in England. In fact, it's estimated that by the time of the American Revolution, 1/3 of all ships owned by English merchants were made in America. Americans also built ships for themselves to begin to take over more and more of the Atlantic trade. So shipping and shipping services became the major export industry of New England. One other thing that is an indication of the future is that one of the reasons New Englanders were able to sell so many ships to English merchants is because they were cheaper than ships built in England. They were not as well built. They didn't last quite as long, but they were cheaper. Americans tended to build things faster, not quite as durable. They didn't have the levels of craftsmanship that English did, but they created markets by building things, making things cheaper and faster. And this is going to be a theme when we talk about the Industrial Revolution in America. These services of supplying timber, fish, shipping and shipping services were expanded through the 1600s and 1700s. New England merchants and shippers began to take over much of the coastal trade up and down the coast of North America. They also provided much of the shipping services of the trade between North America and the West Indies, which became a major market for products exported from North America. So on the basis of that, they began to expand into related markets, they began to expand into related areas, and then in the 1700s, they expand into another related area, which is just totally identified with New England, the area of whaling, sending ships out to capture whales, culminating, of course, in the great novel, Moby Dick, describing it. Already by 1660, and increasingly so through the late 1600s and the 1700s, is the New England economy is becoming integrated into the wider British Atlantic trading system. England, North America, West Indies, and British controlled trade in southern Europe. So that the original attempt to be independent of England, not to be influenced by England, fails because of the necessity of New England to become part of this English trading system if they want to have standards of living above subsistence. Now, this had repercussions back in New England society. The early merchants in New England, by and large, were Puritans, and they went along with many of the regulatory laws that the Puritans put on them in terms of prices, in terms of profits, in terms of what products they could sell, things like that. As time went on, however, and the opportunities to make money grew, is that the merchants in the port cities, in Boston particularly, began to come in conflict with the rules of the Puritan magistrates, and this created continuing conflict. What happened over time was that the merchants fought the attempt to regulate economic activity, particularly in Boston, and by the late 1600s, they were largely successful. Merchants had pretty much taken over city government, Boston city government, although they were never able to take over the colonial government because they were always outvoted by the rural communities. But within Boston itself, at least, the merchants had a position of power. They also were getting, had not only continued ties with merchants back in England, but they were also establishing ties with officials of the English government who more and more in the 1700s wanted to regulate British trade in the Atlantic. So merchants with a different value system were becoming more important and more valuable. This was one factor, not the only one, but one factor that was slowly undermining the Bible Commonwealth, slowly undermining the strict Calvinism in New England. There were new voices that sounded more liberal, at least to the modern ear, more tolerant, and this created conflict. There was new interpretations of Calvinist theology at Harvard and among some of the new ministers that were educated there. So slowly, this tightly knit Bible Commonwealth, run on Calvinist religious principles, was dissolving. And it was dissolving to a large extent because New England could not cut itself off from the rest of the world economically. Is that the desire for having a somewhat comfortable standard of living necessitated trade with England, trade with the other parts of the English Empire, particularly across the Atlantic. The success of New England merchants in doing this has one last consequence. And that one last consequence is that the profits that these merchants made from trade, the profits they made from trying to find places where they could sell their goods, for the carrying trade, to carry other goods, were made the merchant families of Boston wealthy. And later in the 19th century, when the opportunity began to present itself of investing their money elsewhere, it was these profits from this type of commercial trade that was the capital for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in New England.